glitzy and grand affair, as we've just been discussing. Whatever happened to the age of austerity?
Well, we've got to make an impact in an election. You know, if we fought an election, not putting ourselves forward, not putting on a show, we'd soon get criticised for that.
No, I'm serious. A serious question though. But there was, you know, a few months ago, it was that we were heading for the age of austerity, and now it seems that there's money to be spent on, you know, selected things, and everything's going to be okay.
We've got to get the economy moving, and there's no contradiction between that and making sure that we get the debt under control. But that we really do think that to have an extra tax on jobs next year, just when businesses are picking themselves up off the floor, trying to get going, and to hit them with that national insurance rise next year, is the silliest thing you can do coming out of a recession. So we have to find some money to stop that, or a large part of that tax rise, and to stop it on 7 out of 10
I just wonder whether, to a family that's watching the campaign show, who are sad enough to be so obsessed by politics that they're watching us on a Tuesday evening.
Yes,
no, it's
indeed.
a great. No, don't say yes, indeed. It's a great show. What is the one area where this austerity that you were talking about is going to impact upon their lives?
Well, we will have to freeze public sector pay next year, and set an example ourselves, you know, by cutting ministers' pay and freezing it for the rest of the Parliament. We have to start with the politicians themselves. But George Osborne has said we will freeze public sector pay except for the lowest paid. We will raise the state pension age earlier than would otherwise have been the case, a decade earlier than would otherwise have been the case. We will remove some of the benefits from families with more than £50,000 a year. Child trust funds and so on for families over that level of income. So yes, there are things that are not nice things to have to do, but you have to get the debt and the deficit under control.
But isn't the truth that you kind of market tested a policy of age of austerity, and actually you found that voters started to run a mile from it because they thought, oh God, this all sounds grim and ghastly and dark and depressing, and therefore sunshine had to come back in?
No, we've always, throughout, we have always maintained that you've also got to find ways to get some money back to hard-pressed people. For instance, our proposed freeze on council tax, a freeze for 2 years on council tax, which is still our policy, predates what you're describing about the, you know, when we were setting out austerity measures. So these things do go together. We've got to bring the deficit down, but we've got to give some relief to some very hard-pressed people in the meantime.
Yeah.
But don't we feel, sorry, I mean, I think everybody feels, I mean, and today was rather interesting because it was quite original, but everybody feels that neither party is really discussing how we're going to fill this great big black hole. And you think that we don't like it, we the public, you think we're terrified about hearing how we're going to have to pay for the deficit. And so we're sort of skating around it.
I think a really important point is that the big society we were talking about today helps you to start to fill that big black hole, because it's when you involve the public and when they can see every item of government expenditure of £25,000 or more, that starts to help you keep wasteful government spending under control. So these two things go together, the big society and keeping big government under control.
But I was listening to David Cameron's speech today, very, very effective speech, but he used phrases that seem to be leading up to a word that begins with C and has 4 letters, cuts, and he said you know, that there's a huge deficit and there are going to have to be, and you could see him, a little warning light in his brain saying don't say cuts. So he said difficult choices. Nobody will say the word cuts. I mean, will you say the word cut? Just say it for us.
It'll have to be cut. Yes, I think David has said that. It can be amusing to discuss these things, but I think in his speech there, or in his answers to questions, he did say that. Certainly he uses that word on other occasions, because the things I've just been describing to John are cuts in public sector pay, and if you raise the state pension age, you're cutting the overall pension bill.
Cuts in provision. Cuts in provision of public services.
Well, no, of course we don't want to have cuts in provision of public services.
But might that be an inevitability of having to tackle the deficit?
Sure.
No, I don't think it is an inevitability, because I think there is a vast amount of inefficiency in government departments, and I think there is a huge amount that can be done without reducing frontline services. And of course we have protected particular areas and said the health service spending will continue to go up in real terms. And indeed, because the health service wouldn't have to pay a £200 million national insurance rise, there would be more money left in the actual
Hang on,
national
but if
health
you
service.
say that there is so much wasteful spending in government, why is the health service budget going up in real terms?
The health service budget goes up in real terms because drugs become more expensive, hospital operations become more expensive, the
but
population
if there is so much
aging.
waste, then you surely can do the same thing for less.
But the pressures on healthcare are so intense that even if you make savings within the health budget, and of course there will be things that can be done more efficiently. We don't have to have the number of managers going up 5 times faster than the number of nurses, which is what's happening in the health service. But when you save that money, quite rightly, it still has to go back into the cancer drugs and into the operations that are 10 times more expensive now than they were 20 years ago. That upward pressure on health
Labour
spending
say
is
that
there.
you're ending the guarantee for cancer treatment.
Well, they are fighting a scare election, really. And to send these leaflets to cancer patients saying your cancer treatment won't be taken care of under a Conservative really is a scandalous way to behave
Leave
in
aside
the
the
election.
leaflet,
Because
but leave aside the campaigning tactics. But the central point, you are ending that guarantee.
But we're not ending anybody's cancer treatment. We're describing a health service in which they are likely to get a better treatment and which, because that £200 million won't be taken out in national insurance contributions, people, as Andrew Lansley has pointed out, will specifically be able to have some of the expensive cancer drugs that they are denied under the National Health Service now.
Just a simple point of fact, the guarantee would not be in place if David Cameron wins the election.
We're not going to have a whole great system of guarantees and targets. We're going to have a system that performs, that looks after the patient, that is centred on the patient, rather than dictating what everybody will do from Whitehall. And that is central to it. I think people should give us the credit for having a coherent philosophy set out in this doc, which is rare for an election manifesto. It's not just a list of measures. It is an approach to life and government that is set out in this manifesto, including in the health service, to give the people running it more power.
Matthew, I know you want to ask something about policing.
Yeah, the police commissioner who's going to be now elected, is it called a police commissioner in the manifesto? Not going to be the chief constable, so we're not going to elect our chief constable. We'll elect this figure on some kind of a manifesto that he or she will put forward. What powers will they then have to enforce the manifesto? I mean, say someone stands in a local area on the manifesto that sex offenders their names ought to be published in the local newspapers, and they get in with a massive majority. They're not the chief constable, they can't change the law. What are this person's powers?
Yes, well, that, of course, what you're talking about there is a matter of national legislation. So they're not going to be able to do that. That wouldn't be a realistic prospectus on which to run for election. But if they say, we are going to make sure the police force is run in an efficient way, we are going to get more of the officers out onto the beat, we are going to make sure that town X has a higher proportion of the police, or they might want to say the rural areas in this county are neglected, they are going to have a higher proportion of the police, or we're not going to buy we're not going to go ahead with that contract for a new expensive IT system, we are going to spend it instead on more officers. Whatever it may be, these things may be right or wrong, but they should be democratically discussed. Those are the sorts of things that they can put forward.
Put forward?
Yeah, and then if there's no, in an election, and there is at the moment no accountability, what does the citizen in Britain who is concerned about policing in their area do other than complain to their MP and hope he writes to the chief constable, or write a letter to chief constable, wonder whether they will get a reply?
But what are the powers?
In America they do this, but it's so different in America, because in America you elect the guy who's actually collared most criminals, frankly. I mean, the ones who are successful get elected, but it's very hard to judge. I mean, how will we know? How can you check up on this?
Well, they will have to stand for election and when I say put forward, by the way, I mean these are the sort of things they would be able to do if they get elected.
How would they do it if the chief constable doesn't want to do it?
They would have the powers of a police authority now.
Yeah.
There is a body above the chief constable. People may not all know about this, but above a chief constable there is a body of police authority that has these sorts of powers to make the decisions I was just talking about.
Yeah.
But nobody usually knows who they are. They're not really accountable to the voters. And we're meant to live in a democratic country where people can participate. So why can't they participate in these choices?
Yeah, let me just